I was returning from work late at night and passing by a nightclub. I saw a man coming into the hole behind the garbage cans with my wife. To say that I was shocked is an understatement, so I'll tell the story from the beginning. I never imagined my life would come to this. Even now, thinking back to that night, the cold sting of betrayal still burns as fresh as if it happened yesterday. I suppose we all believe that the worst parts of life are reserved for other people. People on the news, or in some story your friend tells you over a beer. But I was wrong. I'd been married to Sarah for nearly 6 years, and in those years, I never thought I'd question her loyalty. She wasn't the type to betray. At least, she didn't seem to be. It was a Thursday night, close to midnight. The rain had started as a light drizzle around dinner, and by the time I wrapped up at the office, it had turned into a steady downpour. Most of the office had cleared out by 8, but I'd stayed, grinding through a stack of paperwork that, honestly, could have waited until morning. I kept my head down, pushed through the hours, barely noticing the time until my phone buzzed with a reminder to get home. On the drive back, the roads were empty, slick with rain. I remember listening to some late-night talk show, barely paying attention to the monotony of it all. I drove the same route every day, every night, a routine so ingrained that I could practically do it with my eyes closed. I didn't think much when I saw the familiar sign for Grady's, the bar where Sarah and I sometimes went for drinks. What struck me first was a flash of red near the back alley, the neon sign at the bar's side entrance, shining weakly through the rain. It's strange, but something about that flash of light made me glance to the side. And that's when I saw them. There she was, Sarah, with her arms wrapped around some guy. He was a tall man, well-built, and laughing with her in a way that felt too close, too comfortable. The sight of them under the dim glow of the backdoor light made my chest tighten. For a second, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. But there was no mistaking her. The red dress she'd worn that morning, the one she said was for work, clung to her in the rain as if she had dressed for him, not me. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. For a long, painful moment, I just sat there, staring, my mind a chaotic mess of disbelief, anger, and pain. I had driven by that bar 100 times without a second thought. But tonight was different. Something in me snapped, like a thread that had been pulled too tightly, and I felt my foot press down on the brake without even thinking. I pulled over to the curb, the rain pelting down as I sat in the driver's seat, watching them. They laughed, oblivious to the world around them, completely consumed in each other. She leaned into him, her face tucked into the crook of his neck, and he wrapped an arm around her waist, pulling her even closer. They were standing at the side door of the club, so close to each other that I could feel the weight of it. The intimacy, the betrayal, the sheer audacity of it all. I don't know how long I sat there, transfixed, unable to look away. I kept waiting, hoping she'd pull back, maybe look around as if this were some cruel joke. But she didn't. She stayed close to him, comfortable in a way that was too familiar, too practiced. The laughter, the touch, the way her hands lingered on his shoulders, it all felt like a punch in the gut, a confirmation that whatever was going on between them had been going on for some time. I thought about calling her name, confronting them both right there in the rain, but something held me back, a cold, calculating voice in the back of my mind that told me not to give in to the anger. Not yet. There was something I needed to understand, to confirm. I had to be sure that what I was seeing wasn't just a terrible, twisted misunderstanding. So I waited, watching them like some invisible ghost, my heart pounding, my mind racing. They finally pulled apart, only to laugh again, his hand trailing down her arm before he reached for the door, opening it for her. She flashed him a smile, one of those rare smiles I hadn't seen in months, and he followed her inside, disappearing into the dimly lit club. The rain poured harder, drumming against the roof of my car like some cruel, relentless reminder. And there I was, sitting alone on the deserted street, rain washing over the windshield, feeling like my entire life had just unraveled in a matter of minutes. But I couldn't let it end there. Not like this. I wasn't sure what I was planning as I got out of the car, my hands clenching and unclenching as if they had a mind of their own. Maybe I just needed to see it again, to understand what had just happened. I walked toward the side door, the rain soaking through my clothes, chilling me to the bone, Yet the cold was nothing compared to the hollow ache growing in my chest. The club wasn't exactly my kind of place. Grady's was more of a dive bar, the kind of spot where you went to drown your sorrows, not where you took your wife to dance in a red dress. I pushed open the door, half expecting to see them right there. But the inside was dim, the crowd sparse, a few groups laughing loudly at the bar. I scanned the room, ignoring the curious glances I got as I made my way to the back, searching for them. And then I saw them again. They were standing in a shadowed corner, far from the crowd. She had her back against the wall, her head tilted back as he leaned over her, his lips close to hers. His hands rested on her waist, moving lower, and she didn't stop him. She didn't even look uncomfortable. In fact, she looked like she was enjoying it. My stomach twisted, while rising as I took it all in. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't some wild coincidence or innocent moment. She was here with him, here with a man who was touching her in ways only I should have been able to. And she wasn't pushing him away. She wasn't telling him it was wrong. I felt my chest tighten, my fists clenching as I forced myself to look away. Part of me wanted to break them apart, to throw him against the wall and demand answers. But another part, a quieter, colder part, told me to walk away. I wasn't sure what to do, but I knew one thing for certain. Nothing in my life would ever be the same after tonight. The rain had picked up outside, pounding harder than ever, and I stumbled back to the door, pushing through it without looking back. I made my way back to my car, numb, barely aware of the rain soaking me to the skin. The drive home was a blur, a haze of taillights and wet streets, my mind reeling with questions that had no answers, only a painful, empty silence. As I pulled into the driveway, I sat there in the darkness, watching the rain streak down the windows. This house, our house, suddenly felt foreign, like it belonged to strangers. Memories flickered through my mind. Laughter, quiet nights on the couch, lazy Sunday mornings. They felt hollow now, tainted by what I'd seen. And for the first time in my life, I realized how fragile it all was, how easily something so carefully built could be torn down in a single night. I went inside, my footsteps echoing in the quiet as I made my way through the empty rooms. Every corner, every photo on the wall felt like a mockery of the life I thought I had. I wanted to scream, to cry, to break something. But all I did was sink onto the couch, staring into the darkness, feeling more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And I knew, as I sat there in the quiet, that there would be a reckoning. But first, I needed answers. Morning light seeped through the blinds, casting thin beams across the living room floor, and I found myself still sitting on the couch, barely having moved all night. I hadn't slept. I don't think I'd even blinked. My mind was numb, replaying the events from the night before on an endless loop. I picked up my phone and stared at Sarah's contact picture, a recent photo of us on vacation in Colorado. Her face was lit up with laughter, hair tossed by the mountain wind, a snapshot of the woman I thought I knew. I thought of all the times she kissed me with that same smile, the times she told me she loved me with those same eyes. It felt wrong, surreal. How had I missed it? How could something so catastrophic be right in front of me, and I never once saw it coming? When I finally heard the familiar click of her key in the lock, my heart hammered against my ribs. A chill ran through me as the door creaked open, and she slipped inside, her heels clicking softly on the hardwood floor. I watched her from the shadows of the living room, unnoticed, while she glanced around with a cautious look, as if she were sneaking back in. And in a way, she was. "Sarah," I called out, my voice sounding hollow in the stillness. She froze, her eyes snapping in my direction, surprise and guilt flickering across her face. "Oh, you're up early," she stammered, gripping her purse a little tighter. I saw her eyes dart away, avoiding mine, and the weight of her deception filled the room, thick and heavy. "Yeah, you could say that," I replied, feeling the words catch in my throat. I wanted to ask her 1,000 questions, to get her to explain what I'd seen. But I was afraid of her answers, terrified of how real this would all become if I actually heard her confess it. Sarah looked at me, her face a careful mask, her voice unnervingly calm. "I had an early work meeting downtown," she said, as if the lie would somehow erase what I knew. She didn't even flinch. I forced myself to hold her gaze, searching for something, anything, that would hint at the truth. But she just stood there, her face unreadable, and I felt my anger start to simmer. I couldn't do this. I couldn't pretend like last night hadn't happened. I took a steadying breath, trying to keep my voice even. A work meeting, huh? I repeated, unable to keep the bitterness from creeping in. Downtown? At midnight? Her eyes flickered, her posture stiffening. She knew then. She knew I'd seen her. But still, she clung to the lie. Yes, she said, her voice barely a whisper now, her hands twisting the strap of her purse. It ran late. The blatant lie hit me like a punch. All I could do was laugh, a bitter sound that seemed to echo in the silence. You know, I thought I'd at least get the truth from you, I said, feeling a wave of exhaustion wash over me. Just tell me, Sarah. Just admit it. Who was he? Her face paled, and she looked down, her hands still clutching her purse as if it were a lifeline. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out, and I watched her struggle for words, her face filled with guilt, fear, something else I couldn't quite place. For a moment, I thought she might tell me. But then, she looked up, her eyes hardening, and I saw the resolve settle in. There's no one, she said, her voice almost defiant now. It's just, work has been stressful, that's all. You know that. I couldn't believe it. Even with the truth staring her in the face, she was choosing to deny it, to act like nothing had happened. A flash of anger surged through me, and I fought the urge to shout, to scream, to make her understand the damage she'd done. But I knew it wouldn't change anything. She was too far gone, too deep into her web of lies to back down now. Instead, I just nodded, letting the silence stretch between us, and I watched as she grew more uncomfortable, her confidence beginning to crack under the weight of my stare. You know, I said slowly, I was out last night too, and I saw something interesting. Her eyes widened just a fraction, a glimmer of panic flickering across her face before she could mask it. I was driving home from work, I continued, and I happened to pass by Grady's. I paused, watching her reaction, and she froze, her expression faltering. Grady's, she repeated, her voice weak. Yeah, I said, letting the word hang in the air. Grady's. You were there, weren't you? She looked down, her face pale, her hands trembling now as she gripped her purse. For a moment, I thought she'd deny it again. But then she let out a shaky breath, her shoulders slumping as she looked up, her eyes filled with something close to desperation. I was there, she whispered. But please, it's not what you think. I wanted to laugh. Not what I think. After what I'd seen, after everything she'd done, she had the nerve to say that. I felt my fists clench at my sides, and I took a step forward, trying to keep my voice steady, though my heart was pounding so hard it hurt. Then what is it, Sarah? I demanded, my voice barely above a whisper. Explain it to me. Explain why you were at that bar with another man, laughing with him, touching him like... I stopped myself, feeling the words choke in my throat. I couldn't even bring myself to say it. She looked away, her face twisted with guilt, and for the first time, I saw a tear slip down her cheek. But I didn't feel sympathy. I felt empty, hollow, like everything I'd ever felt for her had been stripped away in one brutal, unforgiving night. It's just complicated, she murmured, wiping her face. I never meant for you to find out like this. I took a sharp breath, my mind reeling at the audacity of her words. So, what? You were planning on hiding it forever? Keeping me in the dark while you played around with him? I asked, unable to keep the bitterness from my voice. No, she cried, looking at me with wide, pleading eyes. It wasn't like that. I was going to tell you. I didn't know how. The words felt hollow, insincere, and they only made my anger burn hotter. You didn't know how? I echoed, my voice thick with disbelief. You had months, Sarah. Months to tell me the truth, to give me even the smallest ounce of honesty. But you didn't. Instead, you let me believe that everything was fine, that we were still us. She looked away, unable to meet my gaze, and the silence that followed was like a chasm opening between us, widening with every second that passed. I wanted to break something, to lash out, to make her understand the pain she'd caused. But instead, I just stood there, feeling the weight of everything crash down around me. "Who is he?" I asked again, my voice steady but cold. "I want to know who he is." She hesitated, her eyes flicking toward the door, as if she were weighing her options, calculating her next move. And that was the final blow. The realization that even now, she was still thinking about him, still protecting him. "It doesn't matter," she whispered. He's no one." I felt a bitter laugh rise in my throat. "No one? You're telling me that after everything, he's still no one?" "Yes," she insisted, her voice desperate. "It was a mistake, all right? It was a stupid, meaningless mistake, and I'm so sorry. Please, can we just forget this ever happened?" She reached for me, her hand trembling, but I took a step back, putting as much distance between us as possible. I couldn't bear the thought of her touching me. Not now, not ever. "There's no forgetting this, Sarah," I said, feeling a finality settle over me. "I don't know who you are anymore, and I don't think I ever did." The words seemed to crush her, and she looked at me with wide, terrified eyes, as if she were seeing me for the first time, too. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out, and for the first time, I saw the fear in her eyes. She knew it was over. Without another word, I turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the silence of our home, the home that suddenly felt so alien, so empty. As I reached the door, I glanced back, catching a final glimpse of her, her face etched with sorrow, regret, something I couldn't quite place. I knew there was more to this story, more to uncover. But for now, I had all the answers I needed. The rest could wait. The house felt like it was holding its breath. Even as I walked out, every step seemed to echo with a finality I wasn't ready to accept. I paused in the driveway, trying to let the night air clear my mind, to figure out what to do next. But no matter how hard I tried, I kept seeing her face, that moment she hesitated, as if weighing her words to shield him. As I sat behind the wheel, I felt an urge, one that had crept up on me ever since I first caught them. I couldn't stand not knowing who he was, not knowing what kind of man could do this with her so openly. I wanted to see him, confront him. The thought was half-formed, irrational, but as I gripped the steering wheel, it was all I had. I didn't drive straight to Grady's. My hands took over, directing me to the usual places: my parents' house, my best friend's apartment, even the parking lot at my office. But everywhere I went, my mind circled back to the same question. Who was he? Finally, as if surrendering to some invisible force, I turned the car toward Grady's. The city was quiet, the streets empty, but my thoughts roared, each one louder than the last. When I reached the bar, I parked a block away and walked back, my footsteps feeling hollow on the wet sidewalk. I don't know what I expected to find. The bar was quiet now, the neon sign flickering in the damp night. I almost laughed at myself. How did I think I would catch him here again? Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that somehow this place held the answers I needed. After a few minutes of staring at the door, I turned to leave, defeated. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, my heart pounding, and there he was. He was alone, standing at the edge of the alley, looking around with a cautious expression. He was taller than me by a few inches, broad-shouldered, his jaw shadowed with a day's worth of stubble. He looked too relaxed, too comfortable in the shadows, and that only made me angrier. I wanted to storm up to him, demand answers, but I forced myself to stay hidden, to let him move first. He pulled out his phone, glancing at it with a smirk that twisted my stomach. A few moments passed, and he began typing something, his face illuminated by the screen. I could almost imagine what he was saying to her, and I felt my blood boil. Before I could stop myself, I took a step forward. I had no plan, no words, only a simmering anger that had been building since last night. As my shoes scuffed against the pavement, he looked up, eyes narrowing as he spotted me. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone casual, almost amused. The arrogance in his voice shattered whatever restraint I had left. You can start by explaining why you're with my wife. I spat, the words slicing through the air with a venom I didn't recognize in myself. For a moment, he looked taken aback, but he recovered quickly, his face morphing into something colder, something I couldn't place. He let out a short laugh, shrugging as if my anger was an inconvenience rather than a threat. "Oh, so you're her husband," he said, the faintest hint of a smirk on his lips. "She didn't mention you were such a watchdog." The words hit harder than any physical blow, and I felt my fists clench at my sides. "I don't know who you think you are," I said, my voice low, "but you need to understand something. She's my wife, not yours." He shrugged again, a gesture so dismissive it sent a surge of anger through me. "Maybe she was at one point," he said, glancing down at his phone with a nonchalance that was almost theatrical. "But the way I see it, she's a grown woman. She can make her own decisions." I wanted to hit him, to make him feel even a fraction of the pain he'd caused. But even as I stood there, fists clenched, a thought wormed its way into my mind. A thought that made me feel sick. "What did you tell her?" I asked, forcing myself to sound calmer than I felt. "What did you say to make her do this?" He looked at me, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes, and for a second, I thought he'd answer. But then he just laughed, low and cold, shaking his head as if I were some tragic figure in a bad play. "You want to know what I said?" he asked, his voice dripping with mockery. "I didn't have to say much, just that I could give her what you couldn't." Those words were like a slap in the face, a brutal, unfiltered truth that left me feeling hollow. The worst part was, he didn't sound like he was lying. He sounded like he was telling the truth. I took a shaky breath, trying to steady myself. "What does that even mean?" He chuckled, slipping his phone back into his pocket. "Maybe you should ask her that," he said, giving me one last pitying look before he turned and walked away, leaving me standing alone in the rain-soaked alley. I watched him disappear, feeling like the ground had been ripped out from under me. This wasn't just some mistake, some meaningless fling. There was something else, something deeper, and the weight of it pressed down on me, suffocating me. As I walked back to my car, his words echoed in my mind, taunting me. "I could give her what you couldn't." I didn't know what that meant, not yet. But as I sat in the car, the emptiness settled in, the realization that whatever was happening was beyond my control, beyond anything I'd ever imagined. I couldn't just go back home and pretend this was a nightmare I'd wake up from. I needed answers, real answers, and I knew there was only one person who could give them to me. When I pulled back into our driveway, the house seemed to loom larger, its familiar outline now a silhouette of something far darker. As I stepped inside, I could feel the silence, thick and heavy, pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't shake. My eyes scanned the empty rooms, taking in the details with fresh, bitter clarity. There was a photo of us on the shelf by the door, taken just last Christmas. A framed picture from our wedding sat on the side table in the hallway. These were supposed to be symbols of our life together, our promises. But now they felt like cruel reminders, mocking me from every corner. I made my way into the kitchen, grabbing a glass of water to calm myself. My hand shook as I raised it to my lips, and the water splashed over the edge, dripping onto the counter. I didn't feel like myself, couldn't recognize the person staring back at me in the reflection of the darkened kitchen window. I was here, but only as a shell, hollowed out by the realization of how deep this betrayal went. The soft creak of the stairs made me look up, and there she was, standing at the top, her face framed by shadows. She looked uncertain, vulnerable even, as if she hadn't expected me to come back so soon. "Jake?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. I set the glass down, feeling a surge of anger mix with the ache in my chest. "We need to talk, Sarah," I said, my voice tight. I couldn't keep the hurt out, couldn't mask the bitterness. I didn't even want to try. She stepped slowly down the stairs, her gaze shifting between the floor and my face, as if looking at me directly was too much to bear. When she reached the bottom, she stood there, arms folded over her chest, the silence between us stretching out like an unbridgeable chasm. "Who is he?" I asked, the word sharper than I intended. No more excuses, no more lies. I need to know everything. Sarah closed her eyes, her lips pressing together as if she were trying to hold back whatever she wanted to say. But she didn't have a choice anymore. I wasn't leaving without answers. It was a mistake, she said finally, her voice cracking. He doesn't mean anything to me, Jake. I swear. I let out a harsh laugh, the sound grating even to my own ears. Doesn't mean anything? Sarah, you didn't look like you were with some stranger last night. I saw the way you were with him. I saw the way you looked at him. I shook my head, the image of them under the dim light outside Grady's flashing through my mind. You don't look at someone like that if they don't mean anything. She bit her lip, tears welling up in her eyes, but I didn't feel pity. I couldn't. Not anymore. Do you even realize what you've done? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Do you even understand what this has done to us? Her gaze dropped to the floor, and she nodded, wiping a tear from her cheek. I know, she said, her voice so soft I could barely hear it. And I'm so sorry, Jake. I never wanted this to happen. A bitter anger surged up, threatening to drown out every other emotion. Then why did it? Why him? Why now? She hesitated, her gaze flicking up to meet mine for a moment before she looked away. I don't know, she whispered. I don't know why. I guess I felt lost. Lost? The word felt like an insult, hollow and meaningless against the pain she'd caused. You felt lost, so you went to him? You decided that was the answer? No, it's not like that, she said, shaking her head. It was never supposed to happen. We were just talking at first. And I didn't think it would go this far. She looked up at me, her expression pleading. I didn't think it would hurt you like this. Then you didn't think at all, did you? I shot back, feeling the words hit her like a slap. Because I can't wrap my head around any part of this. I don't know who you are right now, Sarah. I don't know who I've been living with. She looked at me, her face crumpling as the tears finally spilled over. But they didn't move me. They didn't soothe the ache in my chest or silence the anger raging in my mind. It was stupid, she whispered, her voice breaking. I know I messed up, Jake. I know I hurt you. And I can't take that back, no matter how much I want to. I didn't respond. I couldn't. The anger was fading, replaced by a hollow emptiness that left me feeling like I was sinking. She took a tentative step closer, reaching out as if to touch my arm, but I pulled back, the distance between us feeling like the only thing keeping me sane. Do you still love him? The question slipped out before I could stop it, raw and unguarded. It was a question I wasn't sure I wanted answered, but I had to know. She shook her head, looking horrified. No, she said, her voice thick with emotion. No, I don't love him. I don't even know what I was thinking. He was there when I needed someone, and I made a mistake. I could see the sincerity in her eyes, the remorse. But it didn't make a difference. Not now, not after everything. I think you should go, I said, my voice sounding foreign distant. Her face crumpled, and she took a shaky breath. Jake, please, don't do this. We can work through this. I'll do whatever it takes. I shook my head, feeling the weight of her words pressing down on me. We can't go back, Sarah. I don't know if I'll ever be able to look at you the same way again. The silence that followed was suffocating. She looked at me, her face wet with tears, but I didn't feel anything. Not love, not hate, just a numbness that made me feel as if I were fading into the background of my own life. Finally, she nodded, wiping her face with trembling hands. I'll go, she whispered, her voice barely audible. But please, Jake, don't give up on us. I didn't respond. I watched her turn, her footsteps echoing softly as she walked toward the door. And then, with a quiet click, she was gone, leaving me alone in the house that was once ours. As I stood there, staring at the door, I felt the full weight of her absence settle over me, a cold and unforgiving reminder of everything I'd lost. But as much as it hurt, as empty as I felt, I knew one thing for certain. I was done with the lies, done with the betrayal, and whatever came next, I'd face it alone. The first day after she left felt like an eternity. I woke up to a quiet house, the spaces once filled by her presence now empty. My mind wandered in circles, trying to grasp at the reality of what had happened. Each attempt to process it led back to the same aching emptiness. I tried to focus on work, on daily tasks, on anything that might fill the hours, but everywhere I looked, memories of her lingered. The sound of her laughter, her scent in the hallway, even the way she arranged her favorite things on the bookshelf. It was all still here, just reminders now, echoes of a life that had cracked wide open. I don't know what I expected her to do once she left, but she surprised me by keeping her distance. No calls, no texts, nothing. It felt strange. I wondered if she was with him, if she'd gone to him for comfort, and the thought churned in my stomach. Part of me wanted to forget, to ignore it all, but the questions wouldn't stop. I needed closure. I needed something final, something that would allow me to piece together what had gone wrong. So, a week later, I made a decision. I called her. The line rang too long, each ring pulling me further into doubt, and I almost hung up. But then, she answered. Jake. Her voice was soft, cautious, as if she'd been expecting this call but dreading it. Sarah, I said, my tone as neutral as I could manage. Can we meet? Just to talk. There was a long pause, and I could almost feel her hesitation through the phone. But eventually, she agreed, suggesting a small cafe on the edge of town. It was a place we used to visit often in our early years, back when life seemed simple. I thought it was an odd choice, but I didn't question it. The cafe was quiet when I arrived, the soft hum of conversation blending with the scent of fresh coffee and pastries. I found a seat by the window and waited, watching the door as each minute ticked by. Finally, she walked in, her eyes scanning the room until she found me. She looked different, as if a weight had settled on her shoulders that hadn't been there before. She walked over slowly, taking a seat across from me, her hands resting in her lap, fingers fidgeting with the edges of her sweater. She wouldn't look directly at me, and I could tell she was struggling with what to say. Thanks for meeting me, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, not sure where to start. The silence between us grew, thick and uncomfortable, until I finally broke it. I need to understand, Sarah. I need to know why. She took a deep breath, her gaze fixed on the table. I wish I could tell you, she murmured. I wish there was a simple reason, something that would make sense, but there isn't. I was feeling lost, like something was missing, and he was just there. That's it? I asked, feeling a sharp pang of anger rise up. You felt lost, so you went to him? Just like that? Her face crumpled, and she looked up at me, her eyes filled with a pain that mirrored my own. I know it sounds horrible, Jake, but it wasn't that simple. I never meant to hurt you. I never meant for any of this to happen. Then why didn't you stop? I asked, my voice hardening. Why didn't you pull away before it went this far? She shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. I don't know. I felt like I was drowning, and he was like a lifeline. But it wasn't real, Jake. It was never real. The words twisted in my chest, leaving me feeling even emptier than before. I couldn't tell if her remorse was genuine or if it was just guilt. But the more I listened, the more I realized that it didn't matter. Whatever her reasons, whatever she had been searching for, it was too late. The damage was done. I leaned back, crossing my arms as I looked at her. And what now? Do you expect me to just forgive you? To pretend like none of this ever happened? Her eyes widened, panic flashing across her face. No. I don't know. I want to fix this, Jake. I want to make things right. I'm willing to do whatever it takes. I felt a bitter laugh rise in my throat. Fix it? I repeated. You think this is something that can just be fixed? She looked down, a tear slipping down her cheek as she shook her head. I don't know, Jake. I don't know what to do. All I know is that I love you, and I hate myself for what I did to us. The words hung between us, heavy and hollow. I wanted to believe her, to take some comfort in the idea that this was all just a horrible mistake. But deep down, I knew that things would never be the same. I couldn't erase what I'd seen, couldn't forget the look in her eyes when she was with him. Love isn't enough, Sarah, I said quietly. Not anymore. She looked up, her eyes red and swollen, and I saw a flash of realization cross her face. She knew, just as I did, that this was the end. There was nothing left to salvage, nothing that could make up for the betrayal that had torn us apart. We sat there in silence for a long time, each lost in our own thoughts, our own regrets. Finally, she nodded, wiping her face as she stood up. "I'm sorry, Jake, for everything." I didn't respond, couldn't bring myself to say anything that would soften the finality of her words. She turned and walked away, her figure growing smaller as she left the cafe, until she disappeared out the door and into the world beyond. I watched her go, feeling a strange mixture of relief and sadness settle over me. This was it. This was the end of a life I had built, a life that I thought would last forever. But in its place was something new, something raw and uncertain. As I left the cafe, I took one last look at the spot where she had been, the empty chair across from me, a symbol of everything I had lost. But as painful as it was, I felt a sense of closure, a quiet acceptance of the path that lay ahead. Whatever came next, I would face it alone. And for the first time, that thought didn't scare me. Subscribe to the channel and like this story if you liked it. Turn on notifications so you don't miss new stories. Click on the playlist on the right to listen to previous stories. See you soon.